You can tell who people really are by how they treat someone they think has nothing. The laughter came first, sharp and effortless, echoing across the polished marble floors of the private dining lounge in downtown Manhattan, where crystal glasses caught the soft golden light, and every tailored suit seemed to carry a quiet price tag of 5 figures or more. And in the center of it all sat Adrian Wolfe, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable, wearing a simple charcoal jacket that didn't quite belong among the designer labels surrounding him, his fingers resting loosely around a glass of water while the men across the table, old college friends turned venture capitalists and startup celebrities, leaned back in their chairs like kings who had already decided the outcome of the night. "Come on, Adrian," one of them said, swirling his drink with a smirk. "You used to be the guy we all looked up to. What happened?" Another chuckled, leaning forward just enough to let his watch catch the light. "Yeah, man, last I heard you dropped off the map. What are you doing now, driving Uber or something?" The table erupted again, not cruel enough to be called hostile, but not kind enough to be harmless either. The kind of laughter that lingered just a second too long, that made it clear this wasn't curiosity. It was entertainment, and Adrian didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, didn't even smile. He just listened, like a man observing a story he had already read to the end, because the truth was, he had chosen this seat, chosen this moment, chosen to walk into a room where nobody would recognize his worth unless it came wrapped in status. Because for the first time in his life, Adrian Wolfe wanted to know what remained when everything else was stripped away. No headlines, no boardrooms, no billion-dollar deals whispered behind closed doors, just a man sitting at a table where nobody believed he belonged. And across the room, unnoticed by most but not by him, a young waitress moved quietly between tables, her uniform simple, her posture calm, her presence almost invisible in a space designed to celebrate excess, until she reached their table and paused for just a fraction of a second, her eyes landing not on the loudest voice, not on the most expensive suit, but on Adrian. And there was no pity there, no calculation, just something steady, something human. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked gently, her voice soft but clear, and Adrian looked up, meeting her gaze, noticing the way she adjusted the edge of the napkin near his plate without making a show of it, the way she placed a small basket of warm bread closer to him than the others, as if she understood something no one else at the table did. And for the first time that night, a faint shift crossed his expression, almost like recognition, while behind her, the laughter started again, louder this time, filling the room with noise that tried too hard to matter. But Adrian didn't look away from her, because in a room full of people who saw him as nothing, she was the only one who didn't seem to need him to be anything at all. The waitress did not leave right away, not like the others who moved quickly to the next table as if speed alone defined their worth. She lingered just long enough to straighten the fork beside Adrian's plate, her fingers careful, precise, the kind of movement that suggested habit but also intention. And when she finally stepped back, she offered him a small nod, not the kind meant to impress, but the kind that acknowledged presence, as if to say, "I see you," and that alone carried a weight the entire table had failed to deliver all night. "You forgot to ask if he can afford dessert," one of the men joked, leaning back with a grin that drew another wave of laughter. And this time Adrian allowed himself a faint breath through his nose, not quite amusement, not quite resignation, just something measured, controlled, because every word they spoke was being filed away somewhere deeper than pride, somewhere closer to truth. "Do not worry," another added, tapping the table lightly. "We can cover it for you. Man, consider it a charity investment." And the word charity hung in the air like a label they were eager to stick onto him. Something easy, something convenient, something that made them feel taller without having to stand up. But before Adrian could respond, the waitress returned, placing a fresh glass of water in front of him without being asked, the condensation cool against the polished wood. "This one is on the house," she said quietly, her voice steady, and one of the men scoffed. "Wow, now you have fans, Adrian. That is impressive." But she did not look at them, not even for a second. Her attention remained exactly where she had chosen it to be. And Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying her now, noticing the small details others ignored. The way her uniform fit just a little too perfectly, The way her posture never collapsed even under pressure. The way her eyes did not flicker when the room grew louder, as if she had learned long ago how to stand still in the middle of noise. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice calm, almost quiet enough to disappear under the hum of conversation around them. And for a brief moment, she hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but as if she were deciding how much of herself to reveal. "Clara," she said finally, and there was something about the way she said it that felt complete, like a name that did not need explanation, and Adrian nodded once, committing it to memory. "Thank you, Clara," he replied, and she offered the smallest smile, the kind that did not seek approval, the kind that existed entirely on its own, before stepping away again. But this time, Adrian's gaze followed her for a second longer than before, because something about her did not align with the role she was playing. And back at the table, the conversation had already shifted, louder, more exaggerated, stories of deals and numbers and vacations measured in weeks instead of days. But Adrian no longer listened the same way, because now there was a quiet question forming beneath the surface of everything else, something that did not belong to them, something that belonged to her. And as he reached for the piece of bread she had placed closer to him earlier, still warm, still untouched by anyone else, he realized that in a room full of people trying to prove who they were, Clara was the only one who did not seem to be trying at all, and somehow, that made her impossible to ignore. The laughter did not stop, it only evolved, turning sharper, more deliberate, as if the room itself had decided Adrian's role and refused to let him forget it. "You know what this reminds me of?" one of them said, leaning back with a slow grin. "Those stories where the guy loses everything and thinks he is still important." Another chimed in, raising his glass slightly. "Except this is not a story, this is just sad." And a few chuckles followed, softer this time, but more pointed, like needles instead of noise. And Adrian let the words pass through him without resistance, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, steady, grounded, because none of this was new to him. Not the judgment, not the assumptions, not the quiet satisfaction people felt when they believed someone else had fallen. But what interested him now was not them. It was the silence between their words, the empty space where something real should have been and never was. And across the room, Clara moved again, her presence weaving through the tables with the same quiet rhythm. But this time there was a shift, subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The manager approached her, speaking in a tone too low for most to hear, yet urgent enough to change the air around her. And she listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed. And then she nodded once, just once, before handing off her tray to another server. And that was when Adrian noticed it, not the action itself, but the precision of it, the way it felt less like someone stepping away from a task, and more like someone preparing to step into something else entirely. "Hey!" One of the men snapped his fingers lightly in front of Adrian, pulling him back. "Do not drift off on us now. We are just getting to the good part." And Adrian turned his gaze back to the table, his expression calm, almost neutral. "I am listening," he said, his voice even, and the man smirked. "Good, because here is a question for you." He leaned forward, lowering his tone just enough to sound serious. "If you had one chance to start over, no money, no connections, nothing, do you think you would make it back?" The table quieted for a moment, not out of respect, but anticipation, waiting for an answer they could reshape into another joke. And Adrian held that silence, letting it stretch just long enough to matter, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged. "I already did," he replied simply, and for a brief second, the confidence in his voice disrupted the rhythm of the room, not enough to stop it, but enough to create a flicker of uncertainty, quickly covered by a laugh. "Sure you did," someone muttered, shaking his head, but Adrian did not react, because he was no longer measuring this moment by their understanding. He was measuring it by timing, and somewhere behind him, near the entrance, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but made people straighten their backs without knowing why. And Adrian glanced at his watch, just for a second, his thumb brushing against the edge of the dial. And under his breath, barely audible even to himself, he murmured, "Right on time." While across the room, Clara disappeared through a side door, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of her presence. And for the first time that night, The laughter at the table felt slightly out of place, like a sound that did not belong to what was about to happen next. The room did not notice the exact moment the energy shifted. It never does. Not when change enters quietly. Not when power walks in without needing to announce itself. But it started with the doors near the entrance opening just slightly wider than before, a subtle movement that drew the attention of the staff first, then the managers, and then, almost like a ripple, the rest of the room followed. Conversations lowering by a fraction, laughter fading just enough to make space for something else. Something heavier, something that carried expectation, and Adrian did not turn immediately. He did not need to, because he could feel it, the same way he had felt it building from the moment Clara stepped away, the same way a storm announces itself before the first drop falls. "What is going on?" One of the men at the table muttered, glancing toward the entrance, his tone curious but edged with irritation at being interrupted, and another straightened his jacket instinctively, as if his posture alone could secure his place in whatever was about to unfold. And then she appeared, not as the waitress they had barely noticed, not as the quiet presence moving between tables, but as something entirely different. Clara stepped forward with a calm confidence that did not demand attention, yet commanded it effortlessly. Her white evening gown catching the soft light in a way that made the room feel dimmer by comparison, her hair no longer tied back, but falling in smooth waves over her shoulders. Her posture unchanged yet somehow elevated, as if the version of her they had seen before had only been a shadow of this one. And the effect was immediate. Conversation stopped, chairs shifted, a few people even stood without realizing they had done so. And near the entrance, the general manager approached her with a respectful nod, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "Ms. Whitmore, the board has arrived. They are waiting for you upstairs." And the name landed like a quiet explosion, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because in a room built on recognition and hierarchy, everyone knew that name. Everyone understood what it meant. And at the table, the men who had been laughing only moments ago froze, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and realization, trying to reconcile the image in front of them with the one they had already dismissed. "Whitmore," one of them whispered, almost to himself, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. But Clara did not look at them. Not yet. Her attention moved calmly across the room until it settled exactly where it had always been, on Adrian. And for a brief second, everything else faded, the noise, the people, the expectations, leaving only the quiet connection that had been there from the start. And then she took a step forward, each movement measured, deliberate, closing the distance between them, with the same quiet certainty she had carried all along. And when she finally stopped at the table, her gaze steady, her voice composed, she said, "I believe this belongs to you," as she gently placed a folded napkin in front of Adrian, the same one she had adjusted earlier, now holding something inside, something unseen but significant, and the room held its breath, because whatever this moment was, it was no longer theirs to control, and Adrian looked up at her, not surprised, not impressed, but understanding, as if everything that had just happened was exactly as it was meant to be. The napkin rested between them like a quiet secret waiting to be understood, its edges perfectly folded, its presence far heavier than something so small should be. And for a moment, Adrian did not reach for it. He simply looked at Clara, really looked at her now, not as the waitress who had moved unnoticed through the room, but as the woman who had just shifted the entire balance of it without raising her voice, without asking for attention. And there was something in her expression, something calm, something knowing, as if this moment had been building long before anyone else realized they were part of it. And finally, Adrian lifted his hand, unfolding the napkin slowly, deliberately, revealing what had been hidden inside, a sleek black card, minimal, elegant, unmistakable to anyone who understood what power looked like when it did not need decoration, and before anyone else could react. One of the men at the table leaned forward, squinting slightly, his earlier confidence slipping, just enough to expose uncertainty. "What is that?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but the question carried tension now, real tension, the kind that comes when control begins to shift, and Adrian glanced down at the card for just a second before placing it gently on the table, turning it so that it faced them, and the reaction was immediate. Silence fell, Not the casual kind that fills a pause in conversation, but the kind that stops thought entirely, because printed in clean, understated lettering was a name they all recognized, a name that did not belong in the version of Adrian they had constructed just minutes ago. And one of them leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening as he read it again, as if repetition might change it. Wolf Holdings, he said under his breath, the words almost reluctant, almost disbelieving, and Adrian finally allowed himself a small shift in posture. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to reveal what had always been there beneath the surface, something steady, something unshaken, something that did not need validation to exist. I never left, he said quietly, his voice even, controlled, and suddenly the room felt different, the same space, the same people. But the perspective had changed, like a lens snapping into focus after being blurred for too long, and the men who had laughed earlier now sat still, their expressions recalculating, adjusting, searching for a version of themselves that fit this new reality. But before any of them could speak, Clara stepped slightly closer, her presence anchoring the moment. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried clearly across the table. It is interesting, she said, her eyes moving briefly over each of them. Not judging, not accusing, just observing how quickly people decide someone's value based on what they can see. And no one responded, not because they did not have words, but because none of the ones they had felt appropriate anymore. And Adrian looked at her again, a faint hint of something warmer crossing his expression, something that had not been there before, because out of everything that had happened, out of all the shifting power and silent realizations, the one thing that remained unchanged was the way she had treated him before any of this mattered, and that, more than anything else in the room, was the only thing that felt real. No one spoke at first, not because they did not want to, but because they no longer knew how. The words they had used so easily just minutes ago now felt misplaced, almost dangerous, like stepping on a ground that was no longer stable. And the man who had laughed the loudest earlier cleared his throat, forcing a smile that did not quite settle on his face. Adrian, you should have said something, he began, his tone shifting, softer now, careful, as if tone alone could undo what had already been revealed. But Adrian did not respond immediately. He simply looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet clarity that made the moment heavier than any accusation could have. Said what? Adrian asked finally, his voice calm, almost conversational, and the question lingered, exposing the truth beneath it, because there was no good answer, not one that did not reveal exactly what had been wrong from the start. And the man hesitated, glancing briefly at the others as if searching for support, but none came. Their confidence had already begun to unravel, thread by thread, replaced by something less certain, less comfortable. That you are still, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without admitting what they had assumed, and Adrian leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, controlled. Still what? He repeated, and this time, no one answered, because the silence itself had become the answer. And across from him, Clara watched the exchange without interruption, her expression composed. But there was a quiet shift in her eyes now, something deeper than observation, something closer to understanding. And she spoke again, her voice steady, measured. It is not about what he is, she said, her gaze moving briefly across the table. It is about what you chose to see. And that landed differently, not as criticism, but as truth, simple and undeniable. And one of the men exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the moment finally settling in. We were just joking, he said, the words sounding weaker the moment they left his mouth. And Adrian gave a small nod, acknowledging it without agreeing, because the difference between a joke and a judgment had already been made clear, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm, but now carrying a quiet authority that had been there all along, just hidden beneath their assumptions. It is interesting, he said, echoing Clara's earlier words, how comfortable people become when they think there is nothing to lose. And no one interrupted, no one laughed, because now they understood that every moment before this had been seen, measured, remembered, and the room itself seemed to hold that realization, the soft lighting, the polished surfaces, the quiet hum of distant Conversations all fading into the background as this table became something else entirely, not a place of status or display, but a mirror, reflecting back exactly what had been shown, and Adrian reached for the glass of water Clara had given him earlier, taking a slow sip, grounding the moment in something simple, something real, before setting it back down with the same steady control. And when he looked up again, his gaze met Clara's, just for a second, and in that brief exchange there was something unspoken, something understood without explanation, because out of everything that had changed, the one thing that mattered had already been decided long before the reveal, and that was the only part of this night that could not be undone. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it for too long, and one by one, the men at the table adjusted in their seats, their movements smaller now, more controlled, as if any sudden gesture might expose just how much had changed, and the same man who had offered to cover dessert earlier leaned forward again, this time with a careful smile that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "Adrian, listen, we did not mean anything by it," he said, choosing his words more deliberately now. "You know how it is, we were just catching up, joking around." But the tone no longer carried confidence, it carried negotiation, and Adrian watched him for a moment, not dismissing him, not accepting the apology either, just observing, as if weighing not the words themselves, but the intention behind them, and before he could respond, another voice joined in, quicker, almost eager. "Yeah, man, if we had known." He stopped himself mid-sentence, realizing too late what that implied, and the unfinished thought lingered heavier than anything he could have said, because it revealed the truth more clearly than any insult had, and Adrian gave a slight nod, acknowledging it without needing to call it out, because the room had already understood, and across the table, Clara shifted her weight slightly, her presence still calm, still composed, but now there was a subtle firmness in it. The kind that did not seek to dominate, but refused to be overlooked. "That is exactly the point," she said, her voice steady, and all attention moved to her again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of something closer to respect. "You would have treated him differently, if you had known," she continued, her gaze moving from one face to another, not accusing, not raising her voice, just stating what was already evident, and no one argued, because there was nothing to argue with, and the man who had spoken first exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the moment had finally settled in fully. "We misread the situation," he admitted, the words quieter now, more honest, and Adrian finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that cut through everything else. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You read it exactly the way you wanted to. And that landed differently. Not harsh, not confrontational, but undeniable, and for a second, no one moved. Because the truth, when spoken without anger, has a way of leaving no room to hide." And Adrian leaned forward just slightly, his hands resting loosely on the table, his posture still relaxed, but now unmistakably present. "You saw someone you thought had nothing," he continued, his voice even, "and you decided what that meant." And the room held that sentence in silence, because it was no longer about him. It was about them, and what they had revealed without realizing it, and Clara watched him. As he spoke, her expression softening just a fraction, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, without bitterness, without the need to prove anything. Just truth, simple and grounded. And as Adrian finished, he leaned back again, the tension in the room shifting once more, not disappearing, but settling into something quieter, something more reflective, and for the first time that night, no one reached for a joke. No one tried to fill the silence, because now they understood that this moment was no longer something to escape from. It was something they had to sit with, whether they wanted to or not. For a long moment, no one reached for their drink, no one checked their phone. No one tried to recover the version of the night they had lost, because something deeper had replaced it, something quieter but far more difficult to ignore, and it was in that stillness that Clara finally turned slightly, her attention shifting not away from Adrian, but outward, toward the room that had been watching without pretending not to, the executives near the entrance, the staff who had paused just a second longer than usual, the subtle awareness that this table had become the center of something unplanned, something real, and she took a slow breath before speaking again, her voice calm, but now carrying a quiet authority that matched the name they had only just begun to process. "There is a reason I still walk this floor myself," she said, her eyes briefly meeting the manager's before returning to the table. "Not because I need to, but because it reminds me what people reveal when they think no one important is watching." And that sentence settled into the air with a weight that extended beyond the table, beyond the moment, because it was no longer just about Adrian. It was about everyone who had participated, even in silence. And one of the men shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of his glass, a habit that now betrayed more than composure. "We did not realize who you were," he said, his voice lower, almost careful, and Clara gave a small nod, not dismissing the statement, but not accepting it as an excuse either. "Exactly," she replied simply, and the clarity of that response left no room for interpretation, and Adrian watched her as she spoke, not surprised, not impressed, but aligned, as if this moment, this reveal, had always been meant to unfold between them, not for them, but through them. And she turned back to him fully now, her expression softening just slightly, the edge of authority giving way to something more personal, something grounded. "You stayed," she said quietly, and Adrian held her gaze, understanding immediately what she meant, not the physical act of sitting at the table, but the choice behind it, the decision to remain present in a space that had offered him nothing but dismissal. "So did you," he replied, his voice just as steady, and there was a brief pause between them, not empty, but full, carrying everything that had been said without needing to be repeated. And behind them, the manager stepped forward again, his tone respectful, measured. "Ms. Whitmore, the board meeting is scheduled to begin in 5 minutes." And Clara nodded once, acknowledging the reality waiting just beyond this moment, the responsibilities, the expectations, the world that would resume its usual structure. The second she stepped away, but before she moved, she glanced once more at the table, at the men who now avoided her eyes, not out of disrespect, but out of understanding, and she spoke one final time, her voice calm, but firm enough to remain long after she was gone. "Next time," she said, "do not wait for a title to decide how someone deserves to be treated." And with that, she turned, her presence moving away with the same quiet confidence it had always carried, leaving behind a silence that felt different now, not heavy, not tense, but reflective. And Adrian remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as the room slowly began to move again around him. But something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, because for the first time that night, the truth had not just been revealed, it had been understood. The room slowly returned to its rhythm, conversations restarting in cautious tones, glasses lifted again, but nothing sounded quite the same as before, because once a truth is seen, it does not disappear. It lingers in the background of every word, every glance, every decision. And Adrian remained seated for a moment longer, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table where the black card still lay, untouched now, no longer needed to prove anything, because the point had already been made. And across from him, the men who had once filled the space with laughter now avoided direct eye contact, their posture adjusted, their voices quieter, not out of respect alone, but out of something closer to awareness, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been revealed. And one of them finally stood, smoothing his jacket in a gesture that felt more like retreat than confidence. "I should get going," he said, offering a brief nod that carried more weight than his earlier words ever had. And the others followed, one by one, their exits polite, controlled, but unmistakably different from the energy they had arrived with. And Adrian watched them leave without satisfaction, without resentment, just a calm acknowledgement of what the night had shown him. Because this had never been about proving them wrong. It had been about understanding what remained when everything else was stripped away. And when the table was finally empty, the noise of the room settling into something distant, Adrian stood, adjusting his jacket with the same simple ease he had carried all evening. And for a moment, he looked toward the entrance where Clara had disappeared, the memory of her presence still lingering in the space she had left behind. And without hesitation, he made his way across the room, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, moving past the polished surfaces and quiet conversations until he reached the private elevator reserved for the upper floors. And as the doors opened, a familiar voice greeted him before he even stepped inside. "You took your time," Clara said, standing near the back of the elevator, her posture relaxed now, the weight of the room replaced by something lighter, something more personal. And Adrian stepped in, the doors closing behind him with a soft, final sound that separated this moment from everything that had come before. "I wanted to be sure," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet meaning beneath it, and she tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And are you?" she asked, and Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he said simply, and there was a brief silence between them, not awkward, not uncertain, just complete, as if everything that needed to be understood already had been, and Clara's expression softened just enough to reveal something genuine beneath the composure. "You did not change when they thought you had nothing," she said quietly, and Adrian gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Neither did you," he replied, and the elevator began to rise, the soft hum of motion marking the transition from one world to another, from noise to clarity, from assumption to truth. And as the city lights reflected faintly through the glass panels above, casting a quiet glow around them, there was no need for anything more, no grand declaration, no dramatic conclusion, because the most important part had already happened, long before the reveal, long before the silence, in the simple, unguarded moment when one person chose kindness without expecting anything in return, and the other recognized it for exactly what it was.